George Samios, head teacher, Twerton Infant School, Sunday the 5th of November. Standing on the round hill, Kelston Round Hill, just taking in what a beautiful city we live in. 180,000 residents, fortunate enough to live in Baines. Fortunate yet, Bath, for all of its positives, is a deeply divided city. There are vast inequalities between those in privileged parts of Bath and those in more deprived parts of this city. One of the statistics that always staggers me is to do with health inequality. If you compare the life expectancy of a man living in Twerton compared to a man living only 5 bus stops away in Lansdowne, there can be a difference of as much as 8 years or more. And that doesn't take into account the extended periods of ill health as well. In order to measure, understand and track the impact of deprivation in our cities, the government groups streets into what are called output areas. From information that the government collects on all of us, they are able to determine what the index of deprivation is in any of the output areas. So this analysis of deprivation is based on 7 factors. The first of these is income. So low level of income determined by being below 60% of the average income before housing costs are taken into account. The second domain of deprivation is employment. The third is education, skills and training. The fourth domain, deprivation, is health and disability. The fifth, levels of crime. The sixth is to do with barriers people face to housing. And the seventh is the environment, the living environment. So from these 7 factors, each output area is given an index between 0 and 1, and that's the percentage of people that fall into deprivation based on those measures. Councillor Joe Raymond has recently done analysis comparing the outcomes of children in Twerton to those in Lansdowne. 100% of children in Lansdowne go on to further education at university or tertiary education. In the distance, you can just about make out the University of Bath. Despite a 3 percentage point increase recently, only 12% of children growing up in Twerton will go to university. We are currently standing at a crossroads in regard to funding for schools. Reform of school funding was long overdue, and the government are proposing a national funding formula to address many of the inequalities that existed under the previous funding regime. Now we're standing at the crossroads because for the next 2 years the local authority can determine and still influence the funding that schools get. The advantage of this was that the local authority was able to use its knowledge and understanding of the characteristics of every school across all of Bath to determine that a fair distribution of funding took place. Across Baines there's currently a consultation on school funding reform. Essentially, this is about what to do in the next 2 years. Whether to introduce the formula, the national funding formula, straight away from 2018, or whether to stay with the LA formula for a further 2 years. This is a hugely significant decision for 12 primary schools out of the 63 in Bath. School funding is quite complex, but one of the key factors is deprivation. Every child is placed in an Headteacher band, so Headteacher being income deprivation affecting children index. To enable social mobility, the idea is that the higher the level of deprivation that a child is in, the more funding that the school receives in order to accelerate that child's progress. Historically, for the top 3 bands of deprivation, where children are living in areas where more than 35% of them are classified as deprived, the school would receive an additional fund of £2,160 per child. For the next band down, that amount would be £480 per child. Under the proposal for the new national funding formula, the highest band of deprivation would get an amount of only £575 compared to the previous £2,160. For children in the second highest band of deprivation, under the funding formula, the new funding formula, they would receive £420 additional funding, down from £2,161. For the third highest band of deprivation, children receive £390. Where the new funding formula is successful in addressing inequality, it is in extending the additional funding to the additional bands E and F, so that children in areas where between 20% and 30% of them are living in deprivation now get some additional funding. The difficulty is for schools that are in areas of high deprivation and that have received much more significant amounts of funding for children in those areas. The challenge will be to meet the needs of those children, but with a much reduced funding stream. The consultation on funding will close on Monday the 13th of November. Following that, Councillor Paul May will make a decision. Alternatively, you could refer it to the Cabinet. But the outcome of that decision, whether to go with a national funding formula or whether to continue to apply an LA formula, will have a profound impact on 12 schools. And these 12 schools are schools in the most deprived parts of the city. For Twerton infants, the decision will mean a difference of £87,000 2018-19 and probably a similar amount 2019-20. For St Michael's Junior School, it will cost £77,000 if the decision goes one way, and for Roundhill Primary it will be a difference of £20,000. This is a huge amount of money for schools in the most deprived parts of this city. The schools in Twerton are in the 10% most deprived parts of the whole country. For schools in an area of high deprivation in Bath, funding can make all the difference to children and their development. It means that we can identify from the very start barriers that children face with their development, their learning, through booster groups, through nurture groups, through one-to-one counselling for children that have experienced early adversity and early trauma. It means we can get resources for children to use in school and at home. We can employ parent support advisors to be alongside and encourage parents so that they feel equipped to support their children at home to raise parental engagement. So many things that we can do with the money that we get, which means that the risk of moving to the national funding formula prematurely would deprive schools in areas of high need of the vital resource.